Hello, and welcome to today's Close Looking. My name is Adam Levine. I am Assistant Curator of European Art, and I am joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Alexa Greist, Associate Curator, and R. Fraser Elliott Chair of Prints and Drawings. Before we begin our conversation, I want to acknowledge that the AGO is built and operates on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, land that has been home to the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. Toronto continues to be home to many Indigenous people and will through the future. Today, Alexa and I thought it would be fun to have a seasonal conversation drawing on some of our great treasures from the collection. We were chatting recently about our holiday shopping, getting a head start, and we started talking about the long history of holiday gift giving. And this brought us to the biblical original gift givers, the Three Magi.
Exactly. And I know Adam has made a beautiful, yep, here's our slideshow.
So just to begin, this is a really fabulous image that allows us to really meet our three characters today, the Three Magi. The Magi are biblical figures. We learn about them from the book of Matthew. They appear as visitors to newborn Jesus in the early days of his life. The account from Matthew is extremely vague. We know very little about them from Matthew. We don't know their number. We don't know that they're Three Magi. We don't know their names, where they come from. We really know that they come from afar. But over centuries, there is this sort of fabulous, rich tradition of the Three Magi that we see in Christian art.
If you don't mind, I'll jump in. I would add one thing too, that in thinking about this and looking into what we do know from the biblical account, I was struck by, and we spoke about this, the fact that there are quite a number of episodes from what we call like the infancy or childhood of the Christ child as represented in the Bible, where there's very little information given, and then there's this growth of artistic output around it. And so the artists are really left to follow other scholars and other writers who try to flesh these out, but also their own imagination and their own inspiration and other works of art they've seen, and build a tradition. And I love, Adam, that you chose this work from our collection as the first image to talk about, because so many of the things you've just mentioned, that although we don't have a direct textual source telling us how many magi there are, the story grows out of the idea that they bring the three gifts. And so many artists and people writing about it take that on to mean there are three magi, and we see three magi or kings here paying homage and bringing their gifts. I'll let you finish describing the work.
Well, so critical to the story of the Magi is that they travel from great distances to visit the newborn Jesus. And so we see that in this wonderful manuscript miniature. And so this comes from a medieval Italian choir book. It's been cut out by a later collector from the larger choir book. And it's just this wonderful, tiny, very small illumination. And so in the foreground, we have one of the Magi kneeling before the newborn Jesus, sitting on the Virgin Mary's lap with Joseph behind. And as we look to the right of the image, we see the other two Magi, and then behind them, horses with their servants. And then as you cross the bar of the initial, there's a full retinue of soldiers and servants accompanying them. And this draws our eye down to a set of ships in a bay to indicate that they've traveled great distances. They've come over the sea, they've walked on land to get to Jesus. The Three Magi, over time, they're assigned names through this development of the story. Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. They sometimes stand in for the three ages of man: youth, middle age, and the elderly. And they also, through this like development of story, also come from different continents. And so it's very common to see one of the Magi as Black and as coming from Africa. And we see that in this manuscript illumination.
Because the time period you're talking about, sorry to jump in too, they don't know about the New World yet at this time. And so well, the so-called New World, so talking about North, Central, South America, they're thinking about the Middle East, they're thinking about Asia, and they're thinking about Africa as the continents that they have in Europe, because it's all Eurocentric, that they have knowledge of.
And of course, the gifts that are identified in Matthew, and those are gold and frankincense and myrrh. Frankincense and myrrh are incense, incredibly sweet-smelling materials. And so we see the Magi holding these elaborate decorative vessels in their hands to contain the gifts. But one of the things that I love about our Italian choir book cutting is that gold is used to mark the borders of the image. And so we get to sort of see this very tactile visual representation of one of the gifts right before our eyes. And I love thinking about the choir book being held before a candle or in front of a window with light streaming in and dancing on this, really precious gold leaf and lighting up the border around the image. So I brought together today a handful of depictions of the Three Magi from the AGO collection, from European art and from prints and drawings, and thought that we could kind of peek through them and see what we can learn about the history of the Magi and gift giving in art.
Good plan.
So the earliest depiction in our collection is a stained glass window from Austria, probably from the 10 years leading up to actually the making of the illumination we just saw. And it's part of a larger set of stained glass that shows the tree of Jesse, which is the sort of depiction of Jesus's family tree. And so you can see that on the right, we have this roundel depicting the adoration of the Magi, the Three Magi coming to give their gifts. And then in the rest of the window, these sort of leaves and figures holding little scrolls to tell the story of Christ's genealogy. But looking at our depiction of the Magi, we start to, it's very easy to see what will become over time this established image of the kings. Often there is one king kneeling before Christ. Sometimes he's even opened up the vessel that he's offering to display the gifts, and so we can see gold coins in this cup that the Magi is holding, or the Magus. And often he has taken off his crown to kneel before Jesus, and we often see the other two still crowned, waiting in turn. Here, one of the Magi is pointing to the Star of Bethlehem, which guided them as their sort of navigational star to arrive at the newborn Jesus. And again, just like in the depiction before, Jesus is often sitting on the Virgin Mary's lap. Of course, he's only a few days old at this moment in the story, so it's ambitious to picture him standing. But many medieval understandings of newborn Jesus is that he was born with preternatural wisdom, and that's why he often also looks sort of like an old man.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting here in this, which is, as you said, our earliest depiction in our collection, showing the Three Magi, that here, yes, the medium is stained glass, so it's glass that has been painted in some cases, has been dyed with minerals in other cases. But if you look at the faces of the Magi, it doesn't seem that one of them, we see sort of the ages of man, in that the figure most on the left does not have a beard. That's your go-to for you are young. And just because you don't have a beard doesn't mean you're a woman. It's one of the things people sometimes say about the argument of the Mary Magdalene and in The Last Supper by Leonardo. Just because you don't have a beard, it may just mean you are the youngest. And that is a shorthand here. But the figures actually all seem to be European figures. And it's really interesting because, as Adam said in the gospel account, it's so vague. that it doesn't say where people are from, and it just says they've come from afar. And so there's not this guidance until around the 15th century, when things sort of start to solidify, and correct me if I'm wrong, that almost always you start to see one of the Magi as being depicted as a Black African.
Yes, so I think the Magi really become these interesting shifting symbols. Sometimes they stand for the ages of man. Sometimes they stand for far off geographies and cultural others. Sometimes they do both. These, exactly as you say, they sort of they look like they're European. I'll note that the faces do appear to have different complexions, and the Virgin's face is especially dark. This is not the original effect, but rather the glass used in a lot of European stained glass from the Middle Ages. The chemical composition for the glass used for flesh tones was particularly responsive to acid rain in the Industrial Revolution. So we have this phenomenon in medieval stained glass that often the faces and hands of figures become blackened over time. But this is not, and it sort of, it can be misleading for like what they originally looked like. So I think one of the reasons that the Magi sometimes become associated with the far off is because the gifts that they are giving were exotic objects for Europeans. The spice trade and the incense trade in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance were huge systems that covered, significant territories. And so sometimes when we talk about the Middle Ages, we think that people didn't travel very much and people lived fairly insular geographic lives. But the truth is that people regularly ate spices that came from far away. People regularly burned incense that came from very far away. And as we, the Magi are sort of interesting because they're also in some ways the first Christian pilgrims. Because they go on foot and travel across huge distances to visit Jesus. And so even in this moment, there were a number of European pilgrims that would have gone to Jerusalem. And frankly, it would have been very exciting, I think, to be a pilgrim in Bethlehem in 1300. And so they do sort of, they're an interesting symbol for us today as we try to kind of unpack European ideas of the far off and cultural others, and how they saw themselves within a broader globe. So they're really they're fascinating. From around the same time period is this wonderful Book of Hours from the early decades of the 1300s, which has this fantastic depiction of the Three Magi. And one of the reasons that I love this manuscript so much, and this particular opening of the manuscript, is because they've organized it such that there's a full page illustration of the Three Magi, and they're kneeling before this tiny initial of the Virgin Mary and Jesus on the other side. And so this story sort of transcends the spine of the book, or the opening of the seam of these pages, in such a wonderful way. I think so often when you open a book and you see an illustration, you expect it to live only on one page. And this one very cleverly kind of draws your eye across the pages. And even, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say too, I love that you draw out this detail of it, because it's so wonderful too to think of someone holding this and just trying to remember the person who would have held this book in their hands, used it for their personal devotion. And the idea too that the illustration leads their eye to also adore the Christ child and the Virgin, and to start reading. So it's that same movement of reading from left to right in the West, and I love that it comes together and is self-guiding in that way, but also just to think about how big is this book, Adam?
Oh, it's teeny tiny.
It's teeny tiny, right? Yeah, just fits in your hands. Yeah, I think it's important to think about those things when we see these objects in the museum and, held on a cradle, carefully in the case, but to remember that people held them in their hands and used them.
And just like the Italian illumination that we started with, the gold background of the image, I think really is this wonderful sort of material, tangible example of one of the gifts of the Magi. And so even though one magus is kneeling and he's opening a vessel that looks like it's filled with gold coins. The gold leaf hasn't been used here on the coins. Rather, it's all this very thick, luxurious gold leaf in the background of the Magi, and in the background of the initial. It's just wonderful. And again, just you think about how this shimmers when you use the book, when you turn the pages, and it's very wonderful. One of the most common areas that we have in the AGO collection, one of the densest collections of depictions of the Three Magi in the AGO is in the Gothic ivories in the Thompson collection. Gothic ivories are these mostly handheld objects made from South African elephant ivory in the 1300s. Paris was an absolute global center for fine carvings in elephant ivory in the 1300s. And this is a diptych, so it's just two panels that are hinged and it sort of opens like a book. And we think that people would have held these sort of portable images in their hands, much like a book, and sat with these for private devotion, sort of reliving the stories of the Bible with these images, these Bibles made of images. And this is a really fascinating example just because it's so beautiful. The image on the left is the Three Magi giving their gifts to the newborn Jesus. There's an angel descending from the architectural eaves holding up the Star of Bethlehem over the Virgin. And I love that so much. And then on the right is the crucifixion and Christ's death. And that scene is also marked by these heavenly bodies. So there's the sun on the left and the moon on the right. This pairing of scenes from the early life of Jesus and his death were very common in small handheld medieval objects. They sort of encapsulate the whole story of Jesus in one object. And again, it's this established version of how we expect to see the Three Magi, right? One kneeling with his crown in his hand, and he's offering up a gift that Jesus is reaching out to receive, and the other two are standing behind, waiting their turns. And I think these are really great examples of the sort of three ages of man. It's difficult to really determine whether these could have stood in for different continents because the material is all white, it's all elephant ivory. But I think that the fact that in this moment, all of the ivory that's being carved in Paris is coming from Southern Africa, it would have been a recognizably foreign object, foreign material that traveled a great distance.
Came from a distance. And I would also say one thing too, that the material being all of one color, because color is a shorthand at this time for blackness can be a shorthand for lumping everyone from one area into one identity. Because I don't want to say race, because as I think we'll discuss, but there is not a concept of race in the same way that we see it today. But one thing I would add is that the crowns look the same. And we'll start seeing, as we see some of these other images, that there's costuming and stereotypical costuming of different regions that also marks out people's difference in a lot of these depictions. And we don't see that here. So I agree with you. I don't think it's supposed to be that an audience would have been looking at and saying that they think of them as from certain places, just that they knew they came from far, bringing valuable gifts.
Yeah, the Three Magi are really interesting for us to kind of explore ideas of what we now call race prior to the human creation of the pseudoscience of race and racial categories. Because I think at this time, it's certainly crystal clear that that people conceived of, say, we can take Europeans as our example because that's the art that we're looking at, conceived of people as being different from them in different areas and even looking different. But this doesn't really follow at all the same exact logics of race as it's created hundreds of years later and sort of undergirds enslavement and colonization. So I think it's just a fundamentally different way of seeing difference in the Magi.
Yeah.
This is another ivory object. It comes from slightly later, and I think it's this is also in the Thompson collection in the European galleries. And this is where we start to see this differentiation through costume of the Magi, right? The figure on the right has this cloth wrapped around his crown and an elaborate feather emerging. And so it sort of takes on like the effect of a turban, because he's the fabric falling down his shoulder. And he's holding, his gift comes in either a drinking horn or perhaps an elephant tusk that's been hollowed out to become a vessel, sort of a reference again to the material that the object is made in, and also to Africa, because that's where the elephant ivory is coming from. And of course, the gold frame for the entire object, this wonderful Gothic canopy, again references the gifts of the Magi.
I love that Christ child here sort of a little more baby-like, a little more. I mean, already a little too much attention placed on the gift, but still, you do see a difference there and a change there, and the small figures holding up a cloth behind the Virgin, a cloth we might call a cloth of honor, where the gold in the illustrated manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts, was taking that place. Here, the material itself of the ivory takes that place, held up by the little putti or cherub figures.
Well, and I love this baby is, I agree, he's very sweet, and he looks like, I have a lot of nieces and nephews that I love very much, and I can easily picture any of them like reaching for a bowl of something that's glittery and shiny that is maybe not something they should have,
yes.
And like having to swoop in and make sure they don't get it. And so, yeah, he's really starting to become much more human and sensitive. And yeah, and even just this wonderful, the artist is taking great care to add little fat rolls in his thigh.
I'm recording something, sweetie.
Okay.
I have a dog delivery. You can bring him. Apologies.
No, I mean, all the dogs, please.
Come here, Bo. Continue speaking, Adam. I will gather this dog.
No, we want to see Bo.
This is Boccaccio. He's our 14th century poet puppy.
I mean, it's not lost on me that we're just looking at the mother and child in ivory, and here you are clutching Bo, who looks like he's just as wiggly as this adorable Christ child. So
pretty much. Thank you.
Hello, Bo. So here's where we get to two objects from the Prints and Drawings collection that they're so fabulous, and I'm going to defer to you on these.
Yeah, these are just wonderful prints that we have on our collection. On the left, a good-sized woodcut by Albrecht Dürer from, as you see on it, 1511. And you see Albrecht Dürer, the AD at the bottom, his monogram, one of the first artists to really consistently tie his monogram to his works and care about that as an identifying proto-copyright, dare I say. But here in this image, which he made another image of the Adoration of the Magi in a series on the life of the Virgin, because not only is it something that we in the Christian tradition is looked at as an event from the life of Christ, it's also an event from the life of the Virgin, of course. But here we see the Christ child. This Christ child is going into the box that is being offered by, as we see here again, the bearded, oldest, probably, even though I will say the guy in the back, the third Magi, has quite a beard on him.
Yeah, he looks
looking straight at us. So that's sort of interesting, because almost always I do agree that you see the oldest one is kneeling. I mean, who knows about their beards? I'm not measuring. But you do see the figure of the Magi whose head is uncovered on the left there. On the right-hand side is St. Joseph behind the Virgin. But on the left-hand side, you do see a figure unbearded again, as you were pointing out. So the youngest figure, unbearded, not wearing their hat. They're holding their hat, which has long, long feathers. That's one thing, just to focus for a moment on the amazing artistry of this artist, of Albrecht Dürer, this German printmaker, and of course, amazing draftsman. His drawings are beautiful, painter. But this is a woodcut. So whether or not he cut his own wood blocks, probably didn't, but he would have designed this and known how to draw the lines in such a way that an incredibly skilled carver would then be able to represent everything from feathers to wood to stone, to straw, to vegetation growing on, broken part of this stable. So he really manages to represent all these different textures. But again, we do see that same elements of the story we've been talking about: a kneeling magi, three figures. They're holding their incredibly valuable gifts, which are in vessels themselves that are valuable. So, and the star that brought them to Bethlehem above them. So a lot of, this iconography by 1511 is quite well set. Looking at the print on the right-hand side by French artist Jacques Ballange. So Adam mentioned Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. And Caspar is often identified as the oldest of the three. I'm not sure why, and there's probably no rhyme or reason. It's just that at some point, one of the written records that gained traction, that was how it was. But here we see a figure who is costumed. If you're someone who is familiar with Rembrandt and Rembrandt's prints and the type of costuming you often see in his figures and paintings, this is a European idea of what somebody coming from, as we mentioned, the other continents, coming maybe from the Middle East, maybe from Asia. In this case, he could be maybe coming from Africa, probably not, but just looking at different animal skins, that sort of looks like it's a pelt he's wearing, a beautiful feather in his elaborately wrapped head covering, and there he is holding some vessel with one of the valuable gifts of the Magi in the center. And
I absolutely love the way that the artist has created a highlight on the vessel to show that it's made of gold and it's so shiny, and it's a very careful, nuanced, it's more about restraint. Like he's held back on just these few tiny passages of white that really make it seem like the light is hitting the object.
Yeah, and he's putting it against the area that he is allowed there to be more lines that would hold the ink, because this is an etching, which means that the ink, when you print from it, it goes into the valleys that are left behind by lines that the artist has made and acid has made. But you're right, he restrains, and that white, as Adam points out, is created by the paper that it's on. It's by not putting lines on it to create that incredible, to create tone out of something that's made solely of line. So it's stunning, and I love it. I love. There are three prints. There are three Magi. We only have this print, but now my eyes are wide open.
Alexa, do you have any family traditions around the three kings or the three Magi?
We do have family tradition around the Magi. My family, my mother is Hungarian, and her family, but they're Protestant Hungarian in a vastly Catholic country. And we take down all of our decorations on the Epiphany, which is in the Christian tradition, or the Western Christian tradition, the day that the Magi visited the Christ child, so January 6th. All the things must come down that day. It's very important. We don't leave them up till mid-January. How about you, Adam?
My mother is from Puerto Rico, and in Puerto Rico, the three Magi bring the gifts. So children leave their shoes out at night and put candy in them for the Magi, sort of like the equivalent of leaving out cookies and milk. And the Magi leave gifts in exchange. We have a pretty streamlined, we celebrate a pretty American Christmas in my family, but I'm aware that that's the Puerto Rican tradition, and maybe one day we'll switch to it.
Well, I like that. Well, and I know we both have a mixture of traditions and religions in our houses, and that this season is full of a lot of light for both of us.
Yes. Well, I wish you a happy holidays, Alexa, and to everyone that's joined in, I hope that this first snow has put you in a holiday spirit and gotten you thinking about different traditions around the world too.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.